One of the most celebrated fashion designers of our time has died today in Paris. Karl Lagerfeld was best known for his work as creative director of the legendary fashion house Chanel. The iconic German designer was also the creative director of Fendi and his own namesake label. His personal style made him one of the most recognizable men in the fashion world. Karl Lagerfeld was 85. And for more on Lagerfeld's life, I'd like to bring in Jeanne Beker, and she's, of course, a fashion columnist and the host of fashion television from 1987 to 2012.
No, not 1985.
1985.
27 years. Yeah,
My apologies.
That was a ride.
1985. And it was actually quite early on into that program that you yourself did get a chance to speak with Karl Lagerfeld.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've spoken to him countless times over the years, but I think the first big sit-down interview I did with him was in 1987, on the eve of one of his couture shows, and this was in July, and it was a sweltering hot day in Paris, and I was very pregnant at the time and feeling like a beached whale, not very attractive, wearing some, olive green muumuu or something. And there I was in his studio, and he would keep people waiting for a long, long time, so I was twiddling my thumbs waiting. And an assistant offered one of the Chanel dresses, saying, would you like to wear something from our archives for your interview? And I thought, wow, you'll never find anything that fits me, though. And they went, oh, no, I think we might have something. And we went into this little room with all these goodies and found the most perfect A-line black and white dress. It was super chic. And I put it on, and it actually fit. And I just felt so fabulous. So then Karl came in about another couple of hours later and saw me in the dress and complimented me on it, said it looked fabulous. And we had the most wonderful, warm, intimate conversation that lasted, really a long time. And at the end of the conversation, he said, I'm going to give you that as a cadeau. That's a present for me. You look so great in that dress. And I thought, wow. And that was my very first bona fide designer dress. And to receive it from Karl, in my pregnant state, what a joy. He was just so generous.
And what do you say to people who say, he wasn't always that generous, or was he always that generous? What was he like as a person?
He was a naughty boy. Karl loved to stir it up, and he would say things often without thinking. He would say some horrible things, actually, sometimes. But I think those of us who really knew and loved him understood him, and he was doing it just to be méchant, as they say in French, a little naughty. He was a great teacher to us all. He taught us not to take ourselves or fashion too seriously, and that's why you had to take much of what he said with a huge grain of salt.
And you've worked in this industry through a lot of evolution of it. So what do you think the legacy is that Karl Lagerfeld leaves behind here?
Oh, I think ultimately Karl Lagerfeld was all about modernity. I mean, he really encouraged people to mix it up. That was a very important thing for him, to mix high and low together. He brought the street to the runway. He's one of the first designers to send sneakers down a high fashion runway. And of course, the way we all love to dress now in this athleisure look, I mean, that was very much a Lagerfeld thing, that salute to chic athleticism. He was very much about looking ahead, with great reverence for the past, but always marching forward. He almost never wanted to talk about what he had just sent down the runway. He wanted to talk about the next collection that he was going to be working on the next day. And he loved young people. He was so kind to all the models he worked with. He really saw those girls as more than mere mannequins, but he wanted to be a mentor to them, and he turned them on to so many wonderful things, and they in turn turned him on to so many things. He was also very much about crossover and mixing, music and art and fashion in interesting and innovative new ways, and just a curious mind. And at the end of the day, despite his sharp tongue, a very gentle soul, and we'll miss him like crazy.
And in terms of the loss itself, and certainly the fashion world will miss a presence like Karl Lagerfeld, but in terms of the house itself, Chanel, who could step into those shoes, and maybe not just at Chanel, but in the industry period?
Well, I mean, they have appointed Karl's studio head, his #1 person to kind of take over and continue on at the creative helm. They will not bring in, a feisty young designer, at least not yet. I think Karl was able to speak the language of Chanel so eloquently, so fluently, so poetically. It's that very spirit that he leaves with the house, and they understand now how they can riff on a signature, on the handwriting of Coco Chanel herself, and just make it different each season with these little intonations and these little nuances. But without any question, it is the end of an era. I know that sounds like such a cliche, but those greats in design, I'm not saying they're not great designers around. There are lots of them, some very, very talented, some innovative, but that age of designer as rock star is really over.
And I did finally want to ask you also about the controversy that sort of followed him too. He was also a controversial figure. Despite that, he managed to be so much in demand.
Because he was a genius, and because that irreverence endeared him to some people as well. Yes, he said and politically incorrect and all that stuff. But if you knew him, and you loved him and you appreciated his genius, you kind of overlooked it because you knew that he was just winding people up. He loved chaos. He loved to create a stir. And it's that irreverence that, in a way, is probably good for us sometimes not to take ourselves too seriously, and certainly never to take fashion seriously.
Words of wisdom from Jeanne Beker. Thank you so much for joining us today.
A pleasure.